Councillor Soshin? When you're ready, thank you. Okay, so hello everyone, thank you for joining on such a wet evening. It's lovely seeing everyone here today. I hope you can hear me. Before the meeting starts, I have a few announcements to make. So in case of a fire, a bell will ring continuously. If this occurs, please leave the building immediately, following the green fire exit signs out to the assembly point, which is by the War Memorial on Duke Street. If anyone requires assistance, please do let me know. Lifts should not be used. Please remain at the assembly point and do not attempt to return into the building until you've been advised that it is safe to do so. The toilets are situated on the landing at the top of the main staircase and on the ground floor in the customer service centre. Anyone filming this meeting is entitled to film it, but I should point out that only the councillors, officers and anyone sitting around these tables may be filmed. Members of the public should not be filmed, so please ensure that cameras are pointed only in this direction. This meeting is also being broadcast via YouTube and recorded. When speaking, please may I remind the board to ensure that you turn on your microphone and to speak closely into it. A red light will appear on the middle button to indicate that your microphone is switched on. When finished speaking, please do remember to turn your microphone off again. I don't think we have any absences, do we?
We do.
Oh.
I've had apologies from Councillors O'Brien and Whitehead, and we've got Councillor Scott subbing for Councillor Whitehead.
I stand corrected. Are there any declarations of interest at this point? No, fabulous. Can I ask the members of the board to agree the minutes of the last meeting? Agreed? Fabulous. And in the interest of time, I have pre-signed it. I know. Okay, so we haven't received any questions from members of the public. These had to be submitted by 7 o'clock on Wednesday. So we'll move straight on to the Norwich to Tilbury pylon proposal, and that is being discussed by Ruth, is presenting.
Thank you. Okay, so first thing to do is just please note the recommendation on page 1 of the PB report where we're seeking delegation to officers. I'll get into the proposal. Lots of the detail on the proposal is actually listed in the agenda pack, so I'm not going to repeat that. In essence, Norwich to Tilbury is a 180-kilometre pylon and overhead line proposal through Chelmsford. And it looks a little bit like this. We've got Norwich at the top, Tilbury at the bottom, and it goes to the western side of Chelmsford. The Chelmsford section of the route is between about 24 to 25 kilometres in length, which is roughly 15 miles in old school. And this is what it's about. The proposal is seeking full and low height pylons within the Chelmsford section of the route, and we've got some examples. We've got a standard 50-metre high pylon within Sainsbury's Southwood and Ferries within the car park, and that's a typical pylon that you would normally see in the landscape. Norwich Tilbury are also proposing some low height pylons, and there's not many of these. We found an example of a slightly older model over in Thirsk in Scotland. The difference between the two pylon designs is the low height ones are 10 metres lower, they're 40 metres high, and they're a little bit more wider. So the average pylon standard height, you're looking at about 20 metres. I've got a ghost in the system. Let's move it back. Come on. Here we go. So just to recap, full height pylons, you're looking at about 20 metres wide, low height or wider, they're about 32 metres, and the pylons would be spaced at about 330 metre intervals along the route. This doesn't fall under the planning regs. It's an application for a DCO, Development Consent Order. It's managed by the Planning Inspectorate on behalf of the Secretary of State, and in this case we run with the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, who at this point in time is Ed Miliband. You've got details of the process on the bottom, and I've got a little X marks the spot as to where we are. We're in pre-examination stage, and we're waiting to start the examination of the proposal, which will be undertaken by the Planning Inspectorate. We submitted some relevant representations in November to the examining authority, and they set out our key concerns and issues on the case. They've been informed by Essex County Council Police Services in respect to the archaeology, the ecology, the landscape and the heritage and the highways, together with our own teams. We have, and at this board, we've consistently maintained an objection to the proposal, which has been based on previous consultation responses. We're not happy with the proposal. National Grid have set out an argument which is based on need. There is a net zero greenhouse gas, or a need to achieve net zero in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's a government set target. The grid's at capacity. In a sense, it is insufficient line transmission along the proposal, hence this has come in. And to be frank, the proposal that has been submitted is defined by cost and has been designed by and at cost. We have a number of main concerns. The primary concern is the impact of the proposal on the countryside, the green belt, the green area. We're primarily concerned about the industrialisation that it would have. It is inappropriate development, and it will be for the examining authority to consider whether very special circumstances apply, which would be the needs case that the grid are making. We've looked at everything in Chelmsford really, really carefully, but we do have a hotspot. That is within the Walthams, where we've got some strong concerns regarding the heritage and visual impacts of the proposal. What this slide does is it shows a change between the height and the design of the pylons, with the full height pylons stopping at the top of the slide in the right-hand corner, extending down to low height pylons through the gap between the Walthams, between the conservation area, where 7 lower height pylons up to 40 metres high are proposed. It's a very narrow gap, as this slide shows you. This is an example of a view just to the north of the street, facing towards Chelmsford Road, looking west with Chatham Hall Lane in the background. What that shows, the top picture, is the views at the moment, open countryside with trees, and then you've got the introduction of the lower height pylons in the below slide, and they're very sited closely to the road. We've got Langley's historic house and gardens to the west offside, and that shows how close this proposal would be. And this is a view which is typical of many along the route in certain locations. What does this mean? So the slide or the pictures map on the right-hand side of the screen, the black line crudely shows the location of the proposal running through the Walthams. It also shows Langley starred in red, and then it also together shows in the pink and blue dots the proximity of other heritage assets. It's got high conservation value. The conservation area is marked and hashed in smaller dots. There would be harm to the Grade 1 listed house and gardens, together with major landscape harm. It's very close to the 2 defined settlements, where the extent of the industrialisation would be felt keenly. We've got some other concerns as well, relating to ecology and trees, and also residential amenity. And the pictures to the bottom are a wireframe that has been prepared by the grid. And this is a typical example of how the pylons could look from effective residential properties. One of the properties that we've identified is Windmill House, which is sited about 70 metres away from some of the pylons. This is a view looking out from the back garden. What it doesn't show off screen is a pylon sited directly adjacent to the west of their property. And we're concerned about the effect of the pylons being overbearing, the impact, the proximity to them. And what you see on the wireframe is them extending into the distance. The concerns that we've raised in Little Waltham are typical to the rest of Chelmsford. There's a lot of environmental impacts relating to landscape, cultural heritage, health and well-being, ecology, biodiversity, and arboriculture. In addition, the ES identifies socio-economic impacts recreation and tourism. There's highways impacts, particularly from construction, loss of agricultural land. And although it's a big proposal, it would also have major cumulative impacts. There's lots of development taking place that needs to be managed. The proposal and the submission at the moment is very silent and limited on community benefits and compensation and mitigation. Minimal mitigation is proposed. There's barely any compensation being offered to affected parties to mitigate against the loss of the proposal. One of the things we also need to look at is the actual DCO, the Development Consent Order itself, as we will be the authority who will be implementing the proposals if they are granted. So we're working through some challenges and with legal. So finally, in terms of the next steps, the examination timetable was published this week on Tuesday, and the examination starts very soon in February and closes in the summer. As officers, we are continuing to work with the grid, other host authorities, the examining board to answer any questions, to try and mitigate against the proposals to secure the best possible outcomes for Chelmsford and our residents. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much for that. That was really helpful. Councillor Jeeps.
When you read the paper, there's clearly going to be a massive, if it goes ahead, drive for the build of these, which is going to be in quite a short period of time. And clearly the kind of vehicles and the access and the amount of people and travel. When we're at the process of trying to build new homes and everything else, has any consideration been given to how that is going to be kind of matched up and mitigated against? Because otherwise we'll be at a standstill, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that us and the County Council are working and looking at, and also something that the examining authority are going to have to consider as part of the cumulative effects. There's an awful lot going on, and we need to ensure that, I'll just stop the slides, these are my backup ones. We need to ensure that the effects are mitigated against. There will be documents, should the proposal be granted, within the construction management plans, which set out how construction can be managed. My understanding is that construction will be phased, so it will take place in sequences, and we can look at the sequencing. But we need to also bear in mind that National Grid want to get on site in 2027. They want a complete build within 2030. We've got a lot going on in terms of the garden community and other proposals. All we can do as a host authority and as the City Council is raise and flag the issues and make sure that the examining authority are very much aware of those.
Excuse me, just one more point that it's not so much a question because you've alluded to it already, but I'm really concerned about the lack of compensation when you mentioned the house, which literally is going to have pylons on top of it. It's not only going to devalue their property, but obviously impact if they stay there on their way of life. And I'm really disturbed that there is no packages put forward or any suggestion of what kind of compensation might be there, because it seems completely unfair that you impose that without any consideration at all.
So at the moment, the government have announced a separate to planning package of compensation, in the sense that persons living within near proximity to the pylons would achieve a modest discount off of their energy bills. And that is a nationwide proposal that is separate. The Grid are not proposing anything particular to residents. There is no community benefit fund at the moment they're proposing. In terms of compensation at the moment, the more realistic compensation that we are negotiating on is some replacement tree planting, together with looking at some biodiversity net gain. There's no landscape compensation. There are maybe separate avenues where we are saying to residents to approach the Grid in terms of land value blight, it's not something that we can get into, and that will be a matter for them to negotiate through with the grid. But I agree with you, it is extremely limited, hence we're flagging it at this meeting today because it's important to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe, perhaps.
Thanks for the report, and I think overall it's very strong, and I'm grateful to the council for the strength of the objections. Just looking at the map, I've wondered about this before. The bit where it goes through Writtle, and you cite so in terms of Writtle being affected, you cite Sturgeon's Farm. It goes very close to Sturgeon's Farm. It actually, if you look at the route, it bends in almost to get nearer to Sturgeon's Farm. I just wondered if we've made representations in terms of strengthening that part of the line. Why is that bent in? Just a question about that and whether we are making representations, because we do cite the proximity to Sturgeon's Farm. Thanks.
At the moment, the grid aren't proposing to make any further changes to the route. They undertook some targeted consultation earlier on last year in respect of making some minor route changes, which was more towards with the Walthams. We can certainly, within the final version of the local impact report, flag that to the examining authority's attention and ask them to consider the relationship and see whether there's any flexibility. It might be helpful at this point just to mention that the limits of deviation, so the red line plan that we would normally consider, does now allow some flexibility for the movement of the pylons within 100 metres of the location of the siting. So there's some limited movement within there that we could perhaps explore to move, see if there's flexibility to move the pylons further away. But I'm more than happy to go back, gives that some further thought and consideration and include that within our comments.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd be grateful if you would. Thank you.
Councillor Manley.
It's just touching on Councillor Jeeps mentioned about the compensation and the idea of giving you money off the energy bill that they've, because of the inconvenience. I mean, it shouldn't blow my mind, but it blows my mind a bit, especially as probably by the time they push the energy prices up, it will kind of be moot anyway. But are we able to say how insulting that is?
I think we can be creative in terms of the language that we can use. As planners, we're not allowed, we're not always able to get involved in the direct effects of compensation. Planning blight, this falls under blight, which is a normal planning consideration. It's compensating people for that land loss. And we can't get involved. It's something we can note. But I think as part of our wider concerns, we can certainly refer to the wider government scheme. It is being drawn up. Personally, I do have a lot of sympathy with that the figures are low, and personally I do acknowledge that. We just need to be careful from a host authority, local planning authority, as to how much we refer to that. But we can certainly make an observation, and if members have made representations to the examining authority and made submissions, it's certainly something that you can do separately in addition as part of any representations that you've made to the proposal. You can certainly be flagging that, or whether that comes through from the parish councils, for example, who might have a little bit more flexibility, shall we say, than ourselves as the city council.
Thank you. Thanks for the report as well.
Councillor Young.
Thank you. It's a huge report, and I'm really grateful for the detail within that report. I just wondered, in some way, in the way it's presented, whether it's possible to draw out the locations that were particularly concerned about, even if it's just the use of bold. It's just that it will catch the eye more. And I think particularly to our residents, we're wanting to draw out the fact that we are particularly concerned about these different locations and concerns. So if we could just, in the text, the format of the text, just try and pull it out a little bit more.
Yeah, that's definitely something we can look at. The reports come to you in draft quite quickly off the back of the relevant representations. They were submitted in November. So I do appreciate, from my personal point of view, there is a little bit of refinement, a little bit more policy emphasis. We need to get the last minute final positions from the County Council. What would be really helpful for me is if there are any locations that members of the board would like me to focus on, in addition to those that we've referred to, please do get in touch and let me know, and we can cross-refer to them in the report, perhaps by including a section of other areas that are of importance. Everything's obviously important though within Chelmsford, but there are areas where we might have some particular concerns that we can highlight to the examining authority. So one of the things we just need to be mindful of in terms of our final submission is that we need to submit our final local impact report to the examining body on the 26th of February. We are seeking delegation to Councillor Moore and to Paul for the final version of the report. So it would be really helpful to understand by the end of January. So if I can set a deadline for you of the 31st of January to have those locations sent through to me, then that will give me enough time to update the report to refer to them if everyone's comfortable with that.
Yes, I wasn't suggesting a major rewrite. It was literally, sometimes you can just take the names and bold them. Yeah. And it just gets people to focus on those areas, because not everybody will read everything.
No. Thank you.
Councillor Ayres.
I've got another question about the compensation, because I think that's quite deeply concerning. I'm interested to learn a bit more about the next steps. So obviously we'll put forward the submission. It includes our concerns. Is that it, or will it come back around later on in the process so we can raise that again? I'm just thinking about, from our perspective as councillors, it's obviously something we're all concerned about. Where's our next opportunity to influence?
So this week, the examining authority issued a document called the Rule 6 letter, which sets out the timetable for considering the application. At the moment, as it stands, we have a constitutional requirement to take the local impact report in draft to this board, and then negotiations, discussions are deferred to officers. This is our third NSIP that we have dealt with within Chelmsford. We're experienced in dealing with this, and I've led the previous two NSIPs. We will have opportunities to make further representations to the examining authority through the open floor hearings, through our negotiations on a document called the Statement of Common Ground, which is based upon discussions, items that we've set out within the local impact report and relevant representations, and we can add, and we are actively encouraged to work through those documents with the examining authority. In terms of adding additional statements and submissions, we have to keep those within the issues that we have flagged already. But given we've raised compensation as a concern and mitigation, and is something that is under active consideration as we speak, we can certainly add, discuss and raise further points within examination. By way of context, the examination process is 6 months. It's a written process with some hearings which are being held within Essex, Suffolk and along the line. So there is opportunity to raise issues further concerns, it's not just us raising these things, it's other host authorities, other parties, and we can pick up on concerns as we move on.
Can I just sort of amplify just what Ruth was saying, is that we are in a formal process now with the examination of these proposals, and effectively the envelope of our comments or our objections are effectively set by the local impact report, but effectively Ruth will be our advocate at the examination, along with, you know, representing and providing evidence on the detail, but underneath those issues that you and the council have raised. So there isn't an opportunity for this to keep on coming back to this board, you know, every time. There's a process that runs. It's very quick, and the inspectors on these keep everyone very regimented. But I think what the board should be aware of is that once we've got that basis of the objections, then we will do everything in our power as officers to get that across and to support that with evidence at the examination process.
Thank you. Are you moving to the recommendations, Councillor Soshi?
Well, I want to say a few words.
Okay, if before you, I'm happy for you to give a few words, and then Councillor Fuller, if he could come in before we move to recommendations.
First, I want to check on the dates. Your dates. You mentioned February. I thought February the 10th is when it begins. Wouldn't we have to have our impact statement in by February the 10th, rather than February the 26th, which I think you mentioned in the commentary? So that's the first. But what I would like to say is, I don't know if I just wait. Oh, well, I'll continue until you can check that out. We have before us a tremendous piece of work by our Chelmsford officers to submit to the Planning Inspectorate. This develops on the representations made on November the 27th. Shortly, I will come to make the formal recommendation. But I would like to say, as in the report just made by Ruth Mabbott, we must recognise that the National Grid has made this inland grid proposal as though they consider the offshore proposal would be very much more expensive, take too long to meet our electricity needs, and have technological difficulties to overcome, especially near telephone cables. As written in the second part of the recommendation, the officers will consult with the examining office to try and obtain change or mitigation. I think you've kind of addressed that to some extent already. And we need to concentrate on the efforts most impacted, and as you've said, around Great and Little Waltham, for example, possibly in other areas, but that's what's come across to me. I'll then come back for a formal recommendation after.
So before moving on to Councillor Fuller, if you have those answers.
So in respect to the dates, we've been invited to a preliminary meeting which will take place on the 10th of February. That is the meeting that kicks off the start of the examination, which we're all in attendance. The date of the 26th of February is deadline 1 of the examination, and that is when the local impact report would be submitted. That's 2 weeks after the preliminary meeting. There will be some hearings, discussions starting that week, though, which will be undertaken by the examining body. So we do need to start gearing up in the next couple of weeks to confirm the details of those and our submissions.
And if I can just confirm then that any amendments proposed by members need to get to you by the 31st of January, still that is the...
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Fuller.
No, I just wondered if there were any updates on the cost of the offshore version. Have there been any more recent reports giving us more details on that?
Not to my knowledge. The grid's position is very much based on the lower cost option, shall we, say, that has been proposed with C-Link being looked at. What we have done is we have sort of had to, as time has passed between the previous policy boards, we have had to amend our position in respect of the needs case. But the C-Link offshore proposals are still looking at within the region of billions of pounds as opposed to millions of pounds. And the steer that we are getting back still from grid is they've got to account for Ofgem, they've got to run this at cost. There can't be additional costs to service users, i.e. us, the people, the customers paying from the grid. So in respect to that, no, nothing further has been really advanced. But we continue to flag it in respect of our objection in principle, and we have acknowledged it that our preference still remains a C-Link route, and that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Manley.
If it sounds like because it's millions rather than billions, it means that they've got some money for compensation then. Thanks.
I think we might be ready to move to the recommendations.
Thank you. So the recommendation to consider the draft local impact report as set out in Appendix 1 and to recommend the Director of Sustainable Communities in consultation with a Cabinet Member for Green at Chelmsford to finalise the local impact report to enable its submission to the Planning Inspectorate by the submission date we've just heard is between February the 26th really, which is still to be, well, it doesn't need to be confirmed because we just said it's February the 26th. To authorise the Director of Sustainable Communities and their appointed office to engage within and respond on behalf of Chelmsford City Council on all matters relating to the examination and subsequently thereafter. I so propose.
Thank you, Councillor Soshin. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Davey. Can I please have a show of hands for all those who are for this recommendation? That makes it easy for me. I don't need to do the other ones. If we can now please move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the local lettings plan. And thank you very much for your time today, Ruth.
Yes, good evening, members. This is a report. It's actually requesting a process as opposed to a policy, which would enable the council to implement local letting plans as and when needed. The council's policy for the allocation of housing is quite refined, it's very legally compliant, it works as well as it can do, bearing in mind the very limited supply of homes we have nowadays, but it's based on the needs of the applicants, which is quite right. There are times, however, as outlined in the report, when we want to make best use of the housing stock, and it's the actual location or the type of housing that's available to meet that need, needs to have some flexibility too. And as we're not a landlord, we can do that, but we can only do it with the approval, consent, support of our partner housing associations, registered providers, but we can't easily amend the allocations policy. So what this is asking for is a very clear, simple process. Local lettings plans have been used in the past in Chelmsford, normally though it's introduced as part of the 106 agreement to say that, for example, rural exception sites. We are facing a situation sometimes now when we may have some properties which need to be allocated in a slightly different way. For example, they'd meet the needs of families who are critically, severely overcrowded, and moving them to a particular property would free up existing stock which can still be offered to other people on the housing register. So it wouldn't be a significant disadvantage. Other times it may arise, might be for social reasons or regeneration purposes where people need to really be kept close to existing local family and such like. We have outlined those examples in the report. What we're asking for actually is, as I say, having a process which we can then refer to, if it's approved, in the allocation policy to say we have got a process for using the local lettings plan as and when needed. They should be used cautiously. You don't want to use it all the time. So therefore, the process also includes ways that we look at impact assessments as well. As I say, it's just, if we can have that process, we can then have more flexibility as and when needed. critical to this, though, is that what we can't do is unfairly prejudice people who are quite rightly have a high priority for housing. So it might delay just until the next property becomes available, but it won't actually stop them from being housed much quicker than it would otherwise be. And sometimes actually it can lead to better results for everybody and even increase the supply of housing overall.
Have you reached the end?
Sorry?
Have you reached the end?
I have reached
Oh,
the
good.
end, yeah.
There was a
That's
pause.
quite brief for me, I know, when it comes to talking about housing, but yes.
There was a
Chair.
pause and we were in stunned silence. We weren't quite sure. Okay. Councillor Jeeps.
I wasn't clear, and maybe it's because I haven't understood the document, but is there a possibility this could lead to enforced movement of people?
No, not at all. No, it's what it would do, for example, where we may have some properties. You can do it with new build because you can do it as part of a planning agreement, so it should go to, you know. But where we may have homes which are so, for example, 5-bedroom properties, there's about 2 in Chelmsford. If one of those came up, we would have a number of families needing them. We might decide that we want to choose for families for whom there's no other option than that particular property. So we'd say it was going to go to families, for example, they might need adaptations and such like, and otherwise it would mean they're just never going to be housed. So we, for example, say, do it, and we would never name the people either, because that would be unfair. We'd have conditions which would actually mean that those families would have additional preference to those properties, but we'd have to make sure that the net supply of homes still remains the same. So it's quite complicated to always give an example, but it's one of those things you'll know it when you see it work. The other thing is obviously if you're then moving a family from, say, a 4-bed to a 5-bed, that 4-bed becomes available for other people. So you can actually use it to create what's called chain lettings sometimes. We can't do it as often as we'd like to, but that's why we'd like to have a process in place. So as and when that opportunity arises, we can talk to, it's often CHP, but it could be another housing association, and engineer it so actually 6 properties, for example, could engineer a net supply of 12 homes. Does that make sense, Councillor? But you'd never say we're going to, that's what eviction's for, actually getting people out of a property, and thankfully we don't deal with that, well, only with temporary.
Thank you very much. Councillor Thorpe-Apps.
So section 1.3, you talk about exceptional circumstances. The policy allows for you, I think, to agree to an allocation to be made otherwise in accordance with the policy. I was just wondering what those exceptional circumstances were. What are you thinking about there?
Where the existing discretion exists for, I don't like to say me because it makes me sound omnipotent, doesn't it? But for a strategic housing services manager, that really is for priority. So that would be, for example, where a person's priority would be in band 2, and there is extenuating reasons why you think, well, I would think that for exceptional reasons, the priority should be increased to, say, band 1, or from band 3 to band 2. That would increase for priority, but it doesn't actually mean that that person necessarily would automatically get a particular property. So it's easy, it's acceptable to have exceptional discretion, and it should only be used exceptionally. I can't think of many cases I've ever used it since I've been back at Chelmsford, to be honest with you, Councillor. That's how exceptional it is, because it just increases a priority. What this does, this evening we're considering, is it actually applies to how the properties are going to be used rather than the priority of a person. I do apologise for the confusion of all of this, but we've got to a stage now of a housing situation where we're really trying to squeeze every possible best use out of everything we can within the confines of the legislation and policies.
Councillor Scott.
Hi. For the 2.2, addressing antisocial behaviour, can you just run through that with me, that particular section, please?
Yes, there can be times, that's normally at the request of a housing association, and we would recognise that. I mean, if they're coming to us to say we've got a problem in this particular part of Chelmsford, this particular road, if we're not aware of it, our community safety team isn't aware of it, then is it really a problem? But sometimes, few and far between, but I have known cases where there's been issues, for example, antisocial behaviour, young people, lots of parties, and it's not just one person, because that's dealt with through eviction. That area just becomes a certain sort of area. You could, with one-bedroom properties, for example, say they should go to couples rather than single people, because that might be a way of having a more stable community than lots of single people. That's set up, and there's lots of lively couples as well. But as I say, and that's why the process we're suggesting is actually one which I would have to advise members. You could, in theory, have a policy for every situation, but through experience, I can tell you, you get that policy drafted, you think you're going to do it, you think it's going to work, and then so-and-so's law comes along, you think, actually, we've just realised it's not quite what we think. So that's why it has to be quite dynamic sometimes. And of course, the other thing is it should always be time limited as well. So once that community, that antisocial behaviour is settled down, you don't want to say you're going to have no single people ever living in that particular area in perpetuity. So as and when it's got more settled, you'd start to actually stop using the local lettings plan and basically go back to what it was always intended, more general purpose.
It sounds very good. Will the residents be told about this if it goes ahead?
Yes, what would happen is that if, for example, it was going to be, I'll use the example of antisocial behaviour. Normally the residents would be saying, please, what are you going to do about it? Yeah. So the landlord would say, we'll speak to a council, see if we could actually have a local lettings plan so we don't have single people, and in that case, if we did keep putting single people in every time a property comes up, Mr. Gaylor would start getting a lot of angry letters and people complaining, so would members too. So yeah, it's, as I say, it's normally self-evident, but you don't really want to be saying, but we can do this every single time, because it just means that all you do then is actually make a complicated system even more complicated and potentially unworkable.
So it's a good deterrent.
Sorry, Councillor Scott, if I can just remind you to speak through the chair. And just so I can understand the question, is it transparency that you're asking about? Is that kind of the heart of it? Will
absolutely,
communities...
spot on. It is transparency.
To people, even if... Because I think that would be helpful for me to understand. Is that even if a problem hasn't been raised by residents, will there be a proactive information being shared? Is that the question?
Prior to the residents, yes, taking on the property, yes.
Okay.
Because I have actually encountered this in my own, in one of the villages within my own ward, and I think it's an excellent idea. So I just wanted it to be clear with Paul, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, I would be keen to know how transparent that would be, and do we proactively inform people if they haven't raised a concern previously?
We wouldn't proactively be informing tenants, because I would say that's very clearly the role of our landlord to do that. And that's what they get paid to do. We get dragged in too often to these sorts of things at times. And also, it would be used as almost like to tackle a neighbourhood problem as opposed to a tenant problem. So if you've got one tenant, then that's normal housing management should deal with that properly. But if you've got an area, like say, you can't pinpoint any one person being at fault because it's a whole class in an area, then actually that's to sort of... So it's engineering a community, if you like, rather than taking action against individual cases. However, I should say I'm very conscious that with neighbourhood issues, they can be very subjective as well. So I think what we wouldn't be doing is introducing something which is being penalising people who need to be housed unnecessarily, which is why, as I say, for his quiet in the appendix, you'll see Mr. Brooks here commented when I showed it to him, and said, well, that's bloody complicated. But unfortunately, we have to be quite thorough. It also has to be quite transparent. So if someone said, well, who's made this decision, we can show that it's actually, A, we've got a process for doing it, it's regulated, it's thorough, and it's consistent, and it's fair, and it's only used as needed.
And would that be with other partner relationships, so for example, the police or other agencies like that?
It would be that having approved this process, if we approve this process, we can say that this particular instance, we've decided to use local lettings plan, and that the council has approved a process by which a local lettings plan can be requested and approved and used, yes.
So say it's, for me to have all this discretion, I would say would be give me too much power.
With great power comes great responsibility. That's twice in 2 days I've said that. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on this matter? No? Oh, Councillor Thorpe perhaps, and then I think we'd move to the recommendation.
Yeah, sorry to come back for a second question. Does it prioritise local residents currently living in the district? Because I think councils can, citing local connection criteria, I think we can do that. So are we doing that in this procedure?
Our allocation policy has to give preference to people who've got a local connection. A local connection can be quite a varied thing, to be honest with you, Councillor. And you can also do it under planning. For example, the rural scheme, that will always be for priority to people of a particular village. What I would say, though, is there are times when our legal duties to house somebody wouldn't always be what is seen to be a person who's of that village or of Chelmsford, but it could be a person who, for example, needs to be housed safely in Chelmsford to escape domestic abuse, or a person who's come out of the forces, who by law now we can't impose a local connection on. So as best we can, but you could do some, I'm trying to think, this gives some flexibility, more flexibility. So I can't think off the top of my head this time of night actually how it could work, but it gives some flexibility as and when we might need it. But so as long as we use it judiciously and not to sort of almost like gerrymander who we house where and how.
Thank you, that's really helpful to know. I think Councillor Soshin, if you're ready.
Yes, the three options, but I'm just going to make the first one to agree the process set out in Appendix 1 for creating a local lettings plan and recommend to Cabinet to approve the document as presented in Appendix 1. Do you need the option of the Director and the Cabinet member making any amendments, officers? Because you normally have that sentence. You don't need it in this case.
No, because it's a process, not actually a policy. We don't need that recommendation.
Okay. Anyway, so I make the propose that as that option is option 1.
Thank you. Can I ask for a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Young. Can I please ask by a clear show of hands those who are in agreement and are for the recommendation? We're flying through the votes tonight. And then if we could please move on to the Chelmsford Local Plan Draft Planning Obligation Supplementary Planning Document. And I believe that's Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this item relates to the revisions to the Planning Obligations Supplementary Planning Document, SPD for short. And these were consulted on last year, in the spring of last year. So just as a quick reminder, SPDs provide guidance on the implementation of planning policies or proposals contained within the local plans, but they don't introduce new policies. Policies are in the local plan, implementation and guidance are SPDs. And the revisions to the SPD primarily reflect changes to the policies in our local plan, the changes that are coming forward. And also, in turn, they reflect our local priorities and also national planning policy. So, in terms of where we've got to, the purpose review and the consultation feedback, so Policy Board considered the draft SPD at its meeting on the 16th of January last year, and it approved the document for public consultation. That was undertaken, as I said, in between February and March last year. And officers, since that time, officers have been looking at, obviously, those responses made to the consultation. Now, originally, we were hoping that those consultation responses would come back to you in the autumn of last year, but the need to undertake the further focus review in the local plan, the additional sites, overtook this process slightly, and that was rescheduled for consideration in early 2026, and here we are. So Appendix 1 to 3 of the item, that provides the consultation responses and the proposed changes to the SPD content. Appendix 1 outlines comments made to the SPD by external consultees. Appendix 2 sets out representations made to the local plan that related to the SPD. And Appendix 3 is our own comments coming from our own City Council services. Appendix 4 provides a composite document which contains those proposed changes. So effectively, just to remind you, the obligations, planning obligations SPD, we've had one of these for probably now on 15 years or so. So it's an established document that sets out what the scope and scale of planning obligations are to different types and different scales of development. It is the SPD is included, and it reflects the changes, as I said, in the local plan and the 2024 MPPF. What members are probably aware of is that the government are consulting on another MPPF. They're coming along thick and fast at the moment. So as a Christmas present to us all, we got one just before Christmas, again, for the second year running. I sound a bit better, but there we are. So it's not that. It is the 2024 MPPF that we're looking at in relation to that SPD. And as I said, we undertook the consultation alongside the local plan, and I've explained the relevant appendices. Now, so really the crux of it is what are the main changes really that we're proposing. And of course, what you'll see in those schedules of comments, you'll see amendments that provide factual updates. They provide clarity as well. Sometimes, we don't get it right first time. That's the whole point of consultation, and address things like typographical errors. So there's those sorts of things that are, as sort of standard matters. In terms of the detail and the content, there is more detail on how self and custom build homes are marketed, and also how the application of biodiversity net gain is applied to those specific types of homes. There's also a specific section dealing with older persons housing, where this was dealt more generically within a section on specialist housing. We feel that there is a need, and following the representations that have been submitted to us, and now a new approach in our policy to dealing with older persons housing, we do feel that there is a need for an updated section on there, and you'll see that reflected in the document and in the schedules. Also making it clear, if viability issues are demonstrated to our satisfaction on development sites, we want to ensure that where there are changes to planning obligations, the council will seek to protect and prioritise rented affordable housing in that process. So it probably feeds in very nicely to what you've just heard. The priority is to make sure that we maximise affordable rented properties, even over other types of affordable tenures, things like shared ownership. So if we're in a situation where viability has been raised, where we're having to determine essentially what planning obligations would have to be amended that aren't policy compliant, we don't want to have a situation where affordable housing is always the one that is picked on first, and that does tend to be the case. And again, there are other matters in relation to Section 106 agreements. We hear about review mechanisms as well. So this is where, if we've accepted that there's a viability issue, we want to make sure that over the period of time, if you think that a normal development can take quite a long time, values change. So if they fix it and say there's a problem now, actually values in 3 or 4 years' time might increase, and then they get effectively like a super profit, the developers. They've fixed the viability. So what we're wanting to do is make sure that through a review mechanism of Section 106 is there's a clear process to identify the surplus profit and for us to get that profit back, effectively, by raising affordable housing. So there's a worked example within the SPD, because some of the developers aren't that keen on this, as you can imagine, but we wanted to make sure that we showed a works example to show exactly how it could work in practice. So next steps in relation to the SPD. It is a bit complicated, this, in the sense that ordinarily we would take these comments, we would wait until the local plan has gone through an examination, because this document is supporting our new local plan policies. They haven't gone through an examination yet, but the government just before Christmas decided to publish some guidance, which was supposed to be helpful. I'm not sure it was that helpful, that said that we needed to adopt SPDs, these style SPDs, by the 30th of June this year, which seems a bit anomalous because you can submit a plan up to the December of this year. So we have gone back to MHCLG to kind of understand whether they meant that or whether that's an error on their part. I've been chasing, but I haven't heard anything back since Christmas on this. So our approach effectively is to remedy this uncertainty. Is we want tonight for Policy Board to consider those changes. We'd like to publish that updated SPD as an evidence base. It's not adopted yet, but it's an evidence base to support our emerging local plan. Now, if the government say that we do have to adopt it by the 30th of June, then we will. We'll take that to Cabinet and we'll adopt it. But we think it's a much more sensible approach, and hopefully, as I've put in here of my notes, sense prevails, that the SPD may well go forward and get adopted at the same time as the local plan that it's supporting, rather than 6 months, 9 months before, which seems a bit of an odd way of doing things. However, we're covering both bases in this recommendation. So effectively, the recommendation that you have before you is set out, hopefully, on the screen, if it ever comes to life. There we go. So effectively, we're asking you to approve the proposed changes that are set out in the appendices, to provide delegated authority to the Director of Sustainable Communities in consultation with the Cabinet member to make any necessary changes prior to publication, to give delegated authority to the Director in consultation with the Cabinet member to publish the modified obligations SPD as an evidence base, and then to recommend to the Cabinet approve the modified planning obligations SPD. And as I said, hopefully it sense prevails and then we adopt it at the same time as our local plan. But if it doesn't, then we would need to take it to a Cabinet before the 30th of June. Apologies, that is a bit of a contorted recommendation. Not my doing, I'm afraid, but that's what we're left with to deal with. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Young and then Councillor Jeeps.
Could I just ask for a bit of clarification over the impact of the new NPPF and the consultation we've gone over the local plan for the additional sites? Is that won't necessitate any change to this SPD?
Yeah, sorry. So and that's precisely why we can't, adopt it before it's been considered. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Yeah. So I mean, ordinarily, what happens is that we get to a final draft like this. It's very useful for a planning inspector that is looking at the local plan to understand how we're going to implement that policy. So we've got to a draft point where we're going to implement that as an evidence base for the local plan. Now, if an inspector started to change the policy, then our SPD doesn't align with the policy that it's actually trying to provide guidance for. So there would be a need to update it. But the problem we've got is that they've given us a cliff edge, and I just want to make sure that we don't have a situation where we're left without an obligations SPD that is as up to date as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Councillor Jeeps.
Yes, yeah, I have 2 points to make, really. I assume that this is all referring to 1.6, and I just wonder if that explains it enough in terms of where we might be if it changes. It ends in, it does appear to be an oversight.
So, I mean, essentially that is explaining that the regulations explainer, which was published just before Christmas, is seeking to provide, enable us to understand the direction of travel. I'm making representations to MHCLG to try and understand what the purpose of that date is, because I just genuinely can't understand what that date, how they've formulated that date. So I think what we will continue to do is to ensure that we've got those two options available to the council. So essentially 1.6 is seeking to explain that complicated position, whereas where we've got two competing dates that government have given us.
Yeah, I just wondered if the explanation you've given about how you're approaching that is reflected fully here, whether it perhaps needs just a bit more clarification. Because at the moment it kind of leaves on the cliff edge that it appears to be an oversight, and what you've said is you're proceeding in one direction, and obviously that will be clarified, but you have a plan. A lot of plans, really.
I've always got a plan, Councillor Jeeps, as a planner. Yeah, I mean, I think the position is when we drafted the report, we were our position was that we thought they made a mistake. I was hoping someone would tell me they've made a mistake, but sometimes government are a little bit slow to actually tell us that they've made a mistake, or whether there is a reason behind the date. And I haven't got that. I haven't got either of those yet, so that's why I'm keeping both options open.
We've just had a helpful recommendation, which is we can include this summary in the minutes of this meeting so that we've got a written explanation.
Yeah, I think that would be useful, because when I read that, it kind of left me at the edge of, well, what is going to happen then? And you've tried to explain, it's not your fault, but you've tried to explain that, but it's actually quite confusing, isn't it?
I agree.
My second point, if I might, Chair, is that in a lot of the accompanying documents, we talk about SIL and 106. And very recently, I sent an inquiry to you about SIL that is not applied to things like huge warehouses, which have a massive impact on the community, creating huge profits for those that are building them, and we don't appear, unless you can correct me, to levy any sort of payment from them for all that is happening, whereas we do for housing and other areas. And I just wonder if it's possible to look at doing that. No, we can't do it retrospectively necessarily, but these things are going to come along more often now, and I just wonder if we are missing a trick in terms of some levy that we could place.
So the SIL charging schedule only has a charge for residential and retail, because when we undertook the viability work in relation to that charging schedule, they were the only types of development that were yielding a surplus to enable a SIL to be charged. Now, what you're talking about is SIL is in addition to Section 106. So Section 106 would still be applicable to all development, that policies that where the policy requires it. So, for example, a large business use or a commercial use that isn't SIL liable would still require significant Section 106 package in relation to roads, in relation to any policy requirements that we have within our local plan. So at this point in time, because successive governments have not decided what the successor is to SIL, we're not in a position where I would recommend to yourselves or to officers that we change the seal charging schedule, because that would open up a whole new can of worms in relation to being viability tested, and it may well be that rates would reduce, not necessarily just increase. So I think until we've got certainty about what the government is doing on an infrastructure levy, then my very keen advice is to stick with what we've got rather than change anything.
Thank you very much. Councillor
Just to follow up on that, if there's going to be a change, is that something we could bear in mind? Because, as I say, it is about the community impact that these places have, and it seems that we do it for one thing but not another, and yet the impact of these is very, very significant. So I take what you're saying about the here and now, but if there's any consultation in the future, I'd ask that might be a consideration. Thank you very much, Chair.
Yeah, we can take that into consideration, but just bearing in mind that it's always based on the viability of the development. So, for example, a commercial development needs to mitigate its own impact in planning terms, and that's done through Section 106. The SIL is on top of that.
It looks like we don't have any more questions or comments on this topic, so if we can move to the recommendation.
Yes, I'm going to make the 4 recommendations there. They're set out there, so I'm not going to read them. So I just propose the 4 recommendations, as you can see on the board. I hope you can all see them as well as I can. I so propose.
I love that. I think it shows how complicated they are. I think it might be the first time you've not read the recommendations in full. I don't know how, at least with me. Yes, they're very complicated, so we want to make sure we're voting in the right way. Could I please have a clear show of hands for those that are... Oh, sorry, I got so shocked that you didn't read them. I got thrown. Could I please have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Davey. Could I please have a clear show of hands for those that are for the many recommendations set out? I think that's everybody's hand. Lovely. I believe we've got one more item left on the agenda, which is the work programme. And I think, Jeremy, you might be speaking on this part.
Sorry about that. I was scrolling downwards. As you can see, obviously we have those 3 items on tonight's committee was self-evident. 19th of March is the next meeting, and our primary item there is the consultation feedback on the additional sites consultation that closed last Thursday. So we can provide what people said in relation to those additional sites. Then on the 18th of May is the lead-in, the first meeting in relation to submitting the local plan. So there's 3 meetings that are programmed to undertake that, and policy board's the first, cabinet the second, and then full council. Quite an important meeting in May. And the only thing I would also add is that on previous work programmes, the strategic strategic economic housing availability assessment, the SHELAR, has been a sort of a perennial visitor to this board. We have decided that because it's evidence-based, and I've taken advice from a director of Sustainable Communities, because it's evidence-based, we don't tend to bring evidence-based to this committee. It's policy that you're formulating, rather than bringing evidence-based halfway through its production. And because the call for sites is open all the time, and the report that comes to you is just for noting, it seems to us that it probably does take up a bit of your time for not an awful lot of benefit. So what we have decided to put to board is that when that is updated, we notify you all. You can ask your questions of the appropriate officer but it doesn't necessarily need to have the airtime in here because, as I said, it's evidence-based, it's just factual, and we're asking you to note it and not make it a decision. So if that is agreeable, that's our proposal.
I think I was querying if we needed to vote on that. I've been advised that it's just for us to note if we're happy. That feels like a halfway vote, but there's some nods, so that's good. Thank you very much. For what it's worth, I will miss the Sheila, but I do appreciate and understand why that makes a lot more sense.
You can still ask questions.
I can still go, how's Sheila going? I think we've possibly reached the end of the meeting. Is there anything else? No. You can all go home, eat dinner and get warm. Thank you very much again for coming. It's lovely seeing everyone.